My name is Emily Parker. Right in the middle of my grandfather's funeral, my aunt stood in front of more than 100 guests and declared that I had only shown up for the money. Whispers spread across the room. Some people nodded in agreement. Some looked at me with contempt. Then my cousin turned on the large screen behind the memorial podium. The first photo appeared, and many people laughed. But no one knew that just a few weeks earlier, one phone call had begun pulling the entire Parker family down from the perfect pedestal they had spent nearly 20 years building. It all began on a cold, rainy evening in Boston. Emily Parker was sitting alone in her office on the 23rd floor of an old building where her company was handling a restoration project. Beyond the glass windows, rain struck the glowing city again and again. Blueprints covered the desk. The clock on the wall was nearing 11 at night. Most of the staff had gone home long ago. Only the light in Emily's office was still on. She was always the last person to leave, not because there was too much work, but because work was the only place where she felt she truly belonged. That was when her phone vibrated. An unknown number, a main area code. Emily almost ignored it, but for some reason, she answered. On the other end was the voice of an older woman. "Is this Emily Parker?" Emily froze. "Yes. My name is Martha. I work at Green Valley Care Center." The moment Emily heard that, her heart tightened. Her grandfather lived there, Harold Parker, the only person in her family who had ever treated her with unconditional love. "Is my grandfather okay?" Emily asked quickly. The woman stayed silent for a few seconds. "Mr. Harold passed away this morning." The whole room seemed to freeze. The sound of rain outside seemed to disappear. Emily said nothing. Her hand gripped the phone until her fingers turned pale. Her grandfather was 90 years old. She knew this day would come, but when she finally heard it, the pain was still as sharp as a blade. After a few minutes of silence, Martha continued, "There is something he asked me to tell you." Emily forced her voice to stay calm. "What is it?" "He said that if anything happened, you had to come back for the funeral. Do not miss it, no matter who tries to stop you." Emily frowned. "Stop me?" The woman sighed. "There are things in your family that Mr. Harold was very worried about. He said the truth would come out, but only if you were there." The call ended. Emily sat motionless for a long time. The office light reflected against the framed photograph on the corner of her desk. It was a photo of her receiving a state award for architectural preservation 2 years earlier, an achievement that no one in her family had ever congratulated her for. In their eyes, Emily would always be the failed daughter, the family traitor, the greedy one. But the real story was completely different. 17 years earlier, when she was only 18, Emily still believed that family was the safest place in the world. That day, her father called her down to his study. Richard Parker sat behind a massive oak desk. He was a man the entire town respected, wealthy, powerful, always appearing in the local newspapers. He pushed a folder toward his daughter. "Sign it." Emily looked down. They were share transfer papers. The shares her grandfather Harold had secretly given her years before. "Why do I have to sign?" Richard raised his head. "Because they belong to the family." Emily looked straight into her father's eyes. "They belong to me." The air in the room instantly became heavy. Richard did not yell. He had never needed to. His coldness was more frightening than any scream. 3 days later, Emily's college fund disappeared. 1 week later, her father stood at the front door and said, "If you walk out of this house, do not ever come back." Emily still remembered exactly how that day felt. The old suitcase, a little savings, nowhere to go. The most painful part was not being thrown out. It was that no one said a word. Her mother turned her face away. Her cousin watched from the staircase. No one stopped her. No one asked how she would survive. From that day on, a false story spread through the entire town, that Emily was greedy, that she had betrayed the family, that she had left because of money, when the truth was that she had only refused to hand over something that belonged to her. Years passed. Emily built a new life with her own hands. She studied on her own, worked on her own, stood back up after every failure. No one in her family appeared when she graduated. No one was there when she received her award. No one stood beside her when her fiancé called off their engagement because he believed the rumors her family had created. But none of that mattered as much as the call she had just received. Her grandfather was gone, and before he left this world, he wanted her to come back. Emily looked out at the night beyond the glass window. A slow sense of unease crept into her heart. Her instinct told her the coming funeral would not simply be a farewell. It would be the place where secrets buried for years would begin rising to the surface, and this time, no one would be able to stop them. 3 days after the call from the nursing home, Emily Parker returned to Cedar Grove for the first time in nearly 20 years. The road leading into town had barely changed. The old shops still lined both sides of the street. The gray stone church still stood on the distant hill. Everything felt so familiar that it almost seemed as though time had never passed. But Emily knew that was not true, because she had changed. The Parker family had not. The moment her car pulled up in front of the funeral home, Emily could feel eyes turning toward her. Some people recognized her, others whispered quietly among themselves. She could not make out what they were saying, but she had grown accustomed to those whispers many years ago. Inside the reception hall, white floral arrangements covered the walls. The air felt heavy with the scent of lilies and the endless repetition of condolences. At the far end of the hallway, Richard Parker stood speaking with a group of local businessmen. He looked exactly as Emily remembered. The expensive suit, the perfect posture, the flawless smile. To anyone looking from the outside, he appeared to be a respected and devoted father. Emily had once believed that too, until the day he pushed her out of his life. Richard noticed his daughter. Their eyes met for a few brief seconds. No greeting, no embrace. Eventually, Richard turned away as though she were nothing more than a stranger attending the service. Emily was not surprised. If anything, it brought her a strange sense of relief. At least he was no longer pretending. As she signed the guest book, a voice came from behind her. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up." Emily turned around. Megan Parker, Susan's daughter, the same cousin who had spent years helping spread every rumor imaginable about her. Megan smiled. But the smile never reached her eyes. "I heard you're doing pretty well for yourself these days." Emily closed the guest book. "I'm doing fine." Megan shrugged. "Grandpa is gone. You must be devastated." The words sounded like sympathy. The tone sounded like an interrogation. Emily did not answer. She simply walked past Megan and headed toward the memorial room. Inside the quiet room, Harold Parker's photograph stood surrounded by white flowers. He was smiling in the picture. The same familiar smile Emily had missed for years. For the first time since returning to town, she felt her throat tighten. Her grandfather had been the only person who called her every birthday. The only one who secretly mailed her letters of encouragement while she was struggling through college, and the only one who had never believed the lies told about her. Emily stood there for a long time. Then her phone vibrated. Jordan Miller, her closest friend since college. Jordan was now a financial auditor, known for uncovering things other people worked very hard to hide. Emily stepped into the hallway. "What happened?" Jordan lowered his voice. "Emily, I reviewed the documents you sent me yesterday." She froze. "The Parker family inheritance files. Something isn't right." Emily leaned against the wall. "What do you mean?" Jordan was silent for a moment. "I think someone altered part of the paperwork." Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Altered it? I can't say with complete certainty yet, but the signature on the newest amendment doesn't match Harold's actual signature." A chill ran down her spine. Her grandfather had only just passed away, and now there was a possibility that someone had tampered with his will. Jordan continued. "I also discovered a company that's been receiving money from the family trust for years." Emily frowned. "What kind of company?" "A company with no employees, no office, no real business operations." Emily immediately understood. A shell company, the perfect place to hide money. Who's behind it? Jordan exhaled slowly. "I'm still investigating, but the name that appears most often in the records is Richard Parker." Emily closed her eyes. Even though she thought she was prepared, the revelation still hit her hard. The father who had accused her of greed, the man who always claimed he was protecting the family, might actually be the person secretly draining the family's legacy. Later that afternoon, as visitors gradually began leaving, Emily returned to her grandfather's old office inside the Parker house. The room had almost been forgotten. A thin layer of dust covered the bookshelves. An old leather chair still sat beside the window. When she opened the final drawer of his desk, she discovered a leather-bound notebook. Harold's familiar handwriting filled every page. Emily slowly turned through them. Work notes, personal reflections, thoughts recorded over many years. Then suddenly, one sentence made her stop. If one day Emily is called greedy, it means someone is hiding something far more important. Emily read the line a second time, then a third. Her heart began pounding. Her grandfather knew. He had known for a very long time. He knew there would come a day when the truth would be twisted. He knew someone was trying to turn her into a scapegoat for secrets they wanted buried. At that exact moment, her phone vibrated again. A new message from Jordan appeared on the screen. Emily, I just found something that could destroy the entire reputation of the Parker family, and I think they'll do everything they can to stop you from finding out. Emily stared at the message for a long time. Outside the window, the sun was slowly disappearing behind the trees. Darkness crept over the town. But for the first time in years, she felt that something far bigger than insults or rejection was waiting ahead. Her grandfather's funeral would not simply be a farewell. It would be the place where secrets buried for nearly 2 decades would finally begin to crack apart. And once the truth came to light, no one in the Parker family would be able to control the story anymore. Until the day of her grandfather's funeral, Emily's family still believed they had complete control over the story. They were wrong. That morning, a cold, gray sky hung over Cedar Grove. Luxury cars lined the street outside the funeral home. Local business owners, corporate partners, city council members, Harold's longtime friends. Nearly every influential person in town was there. The Parker family had always loved grand events. They were the perfect stage for displaying the flawless image they had spent years carefully building. Emily sat in the very last row, exactly where her family wanted her. Far from the center, far from the attention, far from everything. At the front of the room, Richard Parker stood beside the casket, greeting guests more like the host of an event than a man who had just lost his father. Susan moved constantly from table to table, chatting with visitors. Megan walked confidently between the rows of seats, wearing a smile that suggested she was enjoying every moment. None of them looked in Emily's direction, at least not until the speeches began. After the memorial service, Susan stepped onto the stage. She held the microphone with both hands. Her voice carried just enough emotion to sound sincere. Harold was a wonderful father, a respected grandfather, the foundation of our family. Many people nodded in agreement. Susan paused for a moment. Then, her eyes shifted toward Emily. Unfortunately, not everyone in this family understood his value. The room slowly fell silent. Emily knew exactly what was coming. Susan continued. Some people only show up when money is involved. Some people only appear when their interests are threatened. Then, she looked directly at Emily. Some people only remember their family when there's something to gain. Whispers spread across the room. Richard did not stop her. Megan did not stop her. No one stopped her. Emily remained seated. Her face was strangely calm. Susan smiled, satisfied. She believed she was winning. Then, without warning, the giant screen behind the stage lit up. The first image appeared. A younger Emily. Beneath the photo were 2 words, gold digger. A few people laughed. The next image appeared. Family traitor. Then another. Only cares about herself. Megan crossed her arms and watched. Her smile grew wider with every slide. This was exactly what they wanted, to turn Emily into the final joke of the day, to humiliate her in front of the entire town. What they did not know was that Jordan had been preparing for this moment. Emily slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She opened a message. Only 1 word was written inside. Now. Her finger touched the screen. 3 seconds later, the presentation suddenly went black. People looked around in confusion. Susan frowned. Megan turned toward the technical staff. What happened? No one answered. Then the screen came back to life. A new title appeared in large letters: "The Truth About Emily Parker." The entire room froze. Richard immediately jumped to his feet. For the first time that day, he felt something slipping beyond his control. The first image appeared: Emily on her college graduation day. Below it were the words, "No one in her family attended. She graduated with honors anyway." Whispers immediately began spreading through the crowd. The second image appeared: Emily receiving her master's degree. The third showed her accepting a state architectural award. The fourth displayed a historic building she had successfully restored. A new caption appeared: "The woman her family called a failure built projects that will stand for generations." The atmosphere inside the room changed completely. People began looking at Emily differently. There was no pity, no ridicule, only surprise. Then the next section appeared. The screen filled with emails. Sender, Harold Parker. Recipient, Emily Parker. Messages filled with pride, encouragement, support, words that no one in the family had ever known existed. Many guests slowly turned toward Richard. Doubt began to spread, and this was only the beginning. Jordan stepped forward from the back of the room. He walked calmly onto the stage. A thick folder rested in his hands. His voice was steady and clear. "My name is Jordan Miller. I am a financial auditor. Over the past 6 days, I have reviewed records connected to the Parker Family Trust." Richard's face immediately lost color. He knew exactly where this was heading. Jordan opened the folder. Large sums of money have been transferred out of the trust over several years. The total amount reaches into the millions of dollars. The entire room held its breath. The individual who approved these transactions was Richard Parker. A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Susan stepped backward. Megan stood frozen. Richard remained motionless. But the biggest shock had not arrived yet. Jordan removed a small flash drive. The screen changed one final time. A video began to play. Harold Parker appeared. Older, weaker, but his eyes remained bright and clear. He looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this, then I am no longer here." The room became completely silent. Harold took a slow breath. Emily never betrayed this family. His voice remained calm. The person who was betrayed was her. Tears began appearing on several faces. Even those who had believed the rumors could no longer say a word. Harold continued, "If the truth ever comes out, let Emily decide her own future. Do not allow anyone to keep using family as a weapon to control her." The video ended. No one spoke. No one moved. In that moment, the image empire the Parker family had spent nearly 20 years building began to crack apart. And for the first time in his life, Richard Parker realized that he was no longer the one controlling the story. The moment Harold's video ended, the entire funeral home fell silent. The whispers were gone. The mocking looks had disappeared. No one was laughing anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on the Parker family. For the first time in many years, the people who had once been admired throughout the town had become the center of suspicion. Richard Parker stood motionless. His face had gone pale. His lips were pressed tightly together. The man who had always carried himself with absolute confidence now looked as though he was desperately trying to keep his world from collapsing. But everything had already begun slipping beyond his control. A man in the front row slowly stood up. He was a longtime business partner of Parker Development. He looked directly at Richard. "Is what we just saw true?" Richard said nothing. Another voice spoke up. "Are the numbers in that audit report real?" Richard's silence became the answer. The atmosphere in the room immediately began to change. People who had once stood firmly beside him started stepping back. Those who had trusted him exchanged uncertain glances. Susan hurried forward. "This is a misunderstanding. We shouldn't be discussing these things at a funeral." But this time, nobody was listening. An elderly woman slowly rose from her seat. She had been one of Harold's closest friends. Her voice trembled slightly. "If this is a misunderstanding, then why would Harold record that video?" Susan instantly fell silent. Megan's smile vanished. She looked around the room as if searching for an escape, but every face had changed. For years, the Parker family had controlled the narrative. They decided who was good, who was bad, who deserved love, who deserved to be pushed aside. But today, the truth had finally reclaimed its voice. Jordan stepped down from the stage and quietly moved to Emily's side. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, the same way he had stood beside her through some of the hardest years of her life. At the front of the room, Richard finally spoke. "Emily." His voice sounded rough and tired. "Are you satisfied now?" The entire room turned toward her. Emily didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel triumphant. She only felt exhausted from carrying these wounds for so many years. She looked at her father. "I didn't do this for revenge." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Then why?" Emily took a slow breath. "Because Grandpa deserved to leave this world with the truth." She paused. "Not with a lie." Richard said nothing. For the first time in his life, he seemed unable to find an argument. At that moment, Harold's attorney stepped forward. A sealed envelope rested in his hands. I believe it's time everyone heard the rest. Every eye in the room shifted toward him. The attorney opened the envelope. Inside was Harold Parker's final will. Susan immediately stiffened. Megan stopped breathing. Richard clenched his fists. All three believed they already knew what was coming. They were wrong. The attorney began reading. Harold had not left the majority of his estate to Emily. Not the company, not the real estate holdings, not the investments worth millions of dollars. Several guests looked surprised. Emily was surprised too. Then the attorney continued. Harold Parker leaves full management authority of the Parker Scholarship Foundation to Emily Parker. The room grew quiet again. The foundation provided educational assistance to students facing financial hardship across the state. Emily stood frozen, and in that moment, she understood everything. Her grandfather had never wanted to make her richer. He wanted her to have the opportunity to help young people who were facing the same struggles she once endured. He wanted her pain to become something meaningful. Tears slowly filled Emily's eyes, not because of money, not because of inheritance, but because even in his final act, her grandfather was still protecting her. One by one, people began leaving the funeral home. The business partners left first. Then came the social acquaintances who had always surrounded Richard at public events. Then the casual friends. Before long, the large room felt almost empty. The only people who remained were those who genuinely cared about Harold, and those who were now facing the consequences of their own choices. As Emily prepared to leave, Richard suddenly called out to her. She stopped. He stood there for a long moment. Older, more tired, far smaller than the powerful figure she remembered from her childhood. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe," he struggled to continue. "Maybe I was wrong. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't deep remorse. But for Richard Parker, it was the closest thing to an apology he had ever given." Emily looked at him for a long time. Years ago, she had dreamed about hearing those words. She had imagined they would bring relief. But now, the only thing she felt was peace. "I forgive you." Richard slowly lifted his head. "But that doesn't mean things go back to the way they were." Tears appeared in his eyes. Emily offered a sad smile. "Some doors should stay closed once they've been shut." Then she turned and walked away. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. Late afternoon sunlight broke through the remaining gray clouds. Jordan was waiting beside the car. "Is it finally over?" Emily looked back at the funeral home behind her, the place that held nearly 20 years of pain. Then she shook her head. "No." A faint smile touched her lips. "It's only beginning." 1 year later, Emily stood on the stage of the first scholarship ceremony held in Harold Parker's name. Dozens of students sat before her. Hope shined in their eyes. So did possibility. The kind of opportunities Emily once believed she would never have. When the ceremony ended, she stepped outside into the sunlight. Golden rays covered the stone steps in front of the building. For a moment, she thought about her grandfather. She thought about everything that had happened. People had called her a traitor, a greedy woman, a failure. But in the end, none of those labels had ever defined who she was. What defined Emily Parker was her ability to stand up every time life knocked her down. It was her refusal to let pain turn her bitter, and most importantly, it was the lesson she finally learned. You do not need your family's approval to prove your worth. You only need the courage to keep moving forward when nobody believes in you. And that was the day Emily Parker finally became free.